Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Katrina Browning and I'm the Deputy Director for Succeed Together's Montclair Literary Festival. And we're so happy to have you all here today for the 4th Annual Literary Festival. Not quite the one that we were planning, but it's still been a great day so far, and there are loads more events to come today and tomorrow. The festival benefits Succeed Together, which is a Montclair-based nonprofit which provides free educational services for low-income families and children in Essex County. So if you would like to help us continue with our programming, we would appreciate any donation that you can give, and there's a link in the chat where you can donate. Thank you. Also, if you would like to buy the author's books, there's a link below to festival partner Watch on Booksellers. And if you click on that link, it will take you straight through so you can purchase their books. And all of our authors appear for free. So to thank and support them, please buy their books. Thank you. So I'm going to get right in. So we started a few minutes late. I am thrilled. This is one of the talks that I was so interested in when we first set it up. So I'm so glad we're having it today. I'm going to welcome on screen with me Yasemin Besen-Cassino as the moderator for this talk, Women Breaking Boundaries. Yasemin is a professor and chair of sociology and distinguished scholar at Montclair State University, and her work concentrates on gender, work, and youth. She is the editor of Contemporary Sociology and has written 6 books, and her latest book is Cost of Being a Girl, Teen Work and the Origins of the Gender Wage Group. Her work has appeared in many academic journals and featured in popular outlets such as Washington Post, The Guardian, BBC4, The Atlantic, and many more. And thank you and welcome, Yasemin.
Thank you so much. And I want to welcome you to this great event, and thank you to the organizers for bringing together such a very exciting panel. I just want to introduce you to our panel. First, we have Victoria James. She's worked in restaurants since she was 13 and was a certified sommelier at 21, making her the youngest sommelier in the country. Currently, she's the beverage director and partner at Cote, a Michelin-starred hotspot in the Flatiron District. And she's the author of Drink Pink, A Celebration of Rosé, and Wine Girl, The Obstacles, Humiliations, and Triumphs of America's Youngest Sommelier. Welcome. We have Adrian Miller. She was a literary and fiction editor of Esquire from 1997 to 2006, and she's the author of the novel The Coast of Akron and In the Land of Men. And Nancy Princenthal is a New York-based writer. She was the former senior editor of Art in America, where she remains a contributing editor. She has also written for the New York Times and the Village Voice, among many others, and she's on the faculty of the MFA Art Writing program at the School of Visual Arts. She's also the author of Unspeakable Acts, Women, Art, and Sexual Violence in the 1970s. I just want to welcome you all and thank you so much for joining us under extraordinary circumstances. All 3 books have helped me through the pandemic, so I'm very excited to talk to you about your wonderful work. I just want to start with Victoria. I think you describe a fascinating world of restaurants and the sommelier world. And usually when we think of eating and feeding, it's very traditionally feminine spaces. But you describe a very male space and a very toxic male space. And they refer to you as the wine girl. And I just want to ask you, what was it like to be one of the first women, and in some cases, the first woman, in a lot of cases, the only woman in these very toxic male spaces?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for having me here. Sorry, that's my puppy, virtually at least. So at one time I was the youngest sommelier in the country, and working at Michelin-starred restaurants, it's certainly an old boys club, something I like to call the pale, male, and stale world. And last year I did a study with Eater magazine, and we found that 88% of the New York City wine buyers, so these are the people that control everything, that have the power, that are moving the needle in the community with millions of dollars of purchasing, 88% of them were men, and only 1% were Black. So, it gives you an idea of who runs this world and who holds the power. And so being a young woman at 21, becoming a sommelier, the youngest in the country, it was like a lamb being thrown into a den of wolves. And my book talks about how I got here, but also at what cost. And I think that in restaurants, we don't do enough to protect our women. We put them in positions such as hostesses, servers, bartenders, sommeliers, but almost in a way to exploit them and take advantage of their naivete or their beauty or the fact that they're just a minority in this world. And so to climb up the ladder and gain that position of power and to be able to make a real difference and change that, something I'm passionate about, was certainly not easy, but also I think, something was also lost along the way, something I can't ever get back. And so I don't want that to be the case for other young women that are growing up in this industry.
What was your experience like, Nancy and Adrian? Because you both study and have worked in areas that are also predominantly male. What about the art world or publishing world? Do you describe them similarly as male spaces, and what's the role of women?
I guess I'll jump in and say, yes, if you look at, at who the executive directors of the biggest museums are and who the publishers and executive editors of the magazines and other publications, they're men, but it's changing. So, and has changed significantly over the period of time that I've been involved. So, cause for frustration and also cause, I think, for some optimism. It's getting better.
And in my experience in publishing, I worked in male magazines, at men's magazines at GQ and Esquire. I was the literary editor of Esquire at 25. And yeah, the locus of power at these magazines was entirely male. But at Condé Nast, which publishes GQ, most of the magazines at the time, when I was working there, were the people in power were female, actually. I mean, so I was just kind of in an interestingly sort of male sort of space within publishing. So
I think staying with the publishing, I think you both mentioned something about age. If I can go back to age for a second, is it harder for younger women? Because you both mentioned, 21, 25. Is it harder to be a younger woman in these spaces?
I can jump in and say that I can only speak from my experience, so I'm not sure, but I think that it's a dichotomy. I think there's also a lot of ageism that works both ways. I know a lot of my friends are older women in the industry, and they have a lot of problems being hired as well, because there's almost this sexualization of youth, especially if you're trying to sell something like wine, which since the beginning of time has been sexualized as a bacchanalia sort of thing. And so I think it's both, and I think both are a problem.
Thank you. Adrian, going back to the publishing, I think an important part of the job description sounds like the management of genius men. Mm-hmm. What was that like for you? And especially the cultural and emotional expectations from women in such a work environment. What were they like?
Well, as I mentioned, I was 25 when I was hired. And, I was in no way, a shoo-in for the job. In fact, I was no one's first, second, or 100th or 1,000th choice for the job. But I made a test of myself, and I lobbied for myself. I put myself up for a job which had been, this job, literary editor of Esquire, a very sort of prominent job, and two sort of very empowering mid-century male editors had the job, Russ Hills and Gordon Lish. But, I had my own tastes, even at 25, even especially at 25. I had my own literary judgment, and in a lot of important ways, I didn't feel intimidated. Most of the writers with whom I worked, I always felt I was at Esquire for almost a decade, and I felt that we met on an equal plane. My interactions with most of these people, white male people mostly, were polite and appropriate and professional. and in terms of the expectations for, my sort of behavior at work, my boss, David Granger, who hired me, I mean, his only expectation really was that we'd beat the New Yorker, whatever that meant, but, there were, of course, it was a big, prominent job. I mean, particularly in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So, there were kind of, comments that I sort of internalized, like, you don't have any power, you don't have any authority to do this job, and it was, these were sort of criticisms that I internalized. And so in other ways, I sort of was constantly judging myself against this kind of the ideal the ideal literary editor for this job, and those two men, Rust Hills and Gordon Lish. But at the time when I was there in the 90s, also the culture was changing, and nobody, even a male, even a guy editor would not have had as much power as those two men had, And to your point about the genius men, the time in which my book takes place in the land of men, it's the late 90s, early 2000s. We're sort of at the tail end of the great male narcissist, as David Foster Wallace called them. The great male celebrity writer, these larger than life, Mailer, Roth, Updike, and so the sort of the idea of male writer as hero, male writer as mythic figure, in a lot of ways now, 20 years later, that culture is gone. These men are gone, and Norman Mailer, I had, a couple interactions with Norman Mailer. Of course, he was a jerk to me, but that was the Norman Mailer brand, that was to be expected. But, I also became very close with David Foster Wallace now mythic writer, and this book also has a lot to do with the effects that someone like that, a charismatic, powerful, influential older man, can have on a young woman's career, and on her, sense of self. But again, a lot of this stuff was so internalized in me, and that experience gave a lot to me, but it also took away a lot too.
Was that your experience in other areas? I was thinking about the art world, Nancy. Is it a similar world of genius men and management of these genius men?
I guess in my careers as a writer and as a teacher and educator, and initially in the beginning of my working life in the art world, I was a curator and administrator in both big and small nonprofits, the Whitney Museum and Creative Time, which is a nonprofit. And so that, that question gets played out in terms of who my subjects are and who got included in the exhibitions that I was involved with. More, it's a question of who my subjects were when I became predominantly a writer, which has been a slow process. And, I found as a beginning writer in the, this goes back a while actually, in the middle 1980s, that in order to find my place, I was writing initially about art in public places because that's how I came up as a curator. And also increasingly, I found that I was writing about women and to a certain extent, artists of color, partly because those were opportunities. This was work I cared about. And this was work I saw wasn't being given much attention to. So it was a chance, which I took. And it was only in retrospect that I began to see, I've actually built a long list of titles. For a long time, this was in in periodicals, and then in recent years, I've been able to take a deeper breath and write full-length books under my own name, which has been tremendously exciting, and which I've enjoyed a lot. Although I do really like and to some extent miss the sort of fast deadline writing for a monthly or a daily. But yeah, there's plenty of column inches given to whoever, the hot male artists of the day are, and that's still the case. And, as far as age goes, if you're young and really hot stuff, so much the better, bigger headline. And, that's going to be a slow change. And although I don't want to go down this road, I will just introduce the subject that if we're talking about the market, yes, the market does still shine very brightly on male artists. So there's a big differential in how that works for artists. What the attention is and what the market is.
And I think reading all your books, and in Victoria, I was thinking about a lot of fancy chefs or big chefs, and most of them are men, and I think that theme resonated, I think, with all your books.
Definitely, I think in the food world, everyone knows the chefs like Mario Batali and Marco Kira White, the romanticism of these bad boys that do bad things, and then there's very few prominent women chefs that get the spotlight and also get funding for restaurants and the wine world and stuff.
Absolutely, and the culture that goes with it. And I think very related to breaking boundaries is the sexual violence in the workplace. And I just wanted to go back to Nancy for a second, and I, especially going to her book, and it continues to be a part of women's lives and workplaces. And you talk about the popular depictions of violence against women. I just wanted to go back to that. And how are they depicted? And in creating kind of social change, what's the role of art?
It's a good question, and I think the short answer is the role of art is big. Art actually does make a difference, and these tend to be kind of polarized popular culture and art as such, and they're both important. If we're talking about the representation of sexual violence in popular culture, we can start with Law and Order's Special Victims Unit. That's a show that's been on air since 1999. That's so one way of looking at that is things are not changing that quickly. Same show, same theme. But on the other hand, the subjects that have been covered, and I'm not a regular watcher, but I have an idea of what the landscape is there, have become more specific, more particularized, and much more honest. And I think that honesty is, of course, what we're looking for in addressing sexual violence and talking about rape, both within the popular culture and within art. And that's where the gains have been made and where changes have been made. That, I think it's not unreasonable to think about the media play that has come along with exposing people like Jeffrey Epstein and Harvey Weinstein, and how those stories unfolded, what women felt comfortable saying in the media, in public, changed day by day. If we think about the Weinstein exposure, women were first reluctant to say exactly how far they had been pushed to go. There was one storyline, and then the storyline began to change. But as far as the subject that I actually wanted to focus on in my book, we're talking about visual art world and really taking up the subject in the 1970s. And at that point, there was no, apart from salacious plot lines in Hollywood movies and, representing sexual violence in art goes back to antiquity. It goes, or at least the subject does. And it certainly goes all the way through visual art from the Renaissance forward, usually in the hands of men. So when women took up the story in the 1970s and began making it part of performance work and art as activism, they were saying things that had really never been said. And that, that's huge. Women putting their bodies on the line literally, to expose and explore what the experience of violation was like, left audiences stunned. And similarly, taking to the streets and activist art sort of introduced a new genre, art as activism, in the service of pushing the boundaries on what could be said and known about sexual violence, the extent of it, and also reconfigured the landscape of the art world. So these were really big changes.
Yeah, I wonder, you talk about the 70s as this big important point. What was so special about the 70s?
Oh, the 70s is, where I'm a person. Let's see. The 70s was important to me because those ways of thinking about difficult subjects first came into focus, performance art and art as activism. But it was also where I focused the attention of my book, because it was a period of epic violence. And it was, of course, the period when second wave feminism emerged, partly in response to really a kind of outrageous misogyny within the activist movements that a lot of second wave feminists came up in, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movements, really rife with quite bad behavior toward women. And, when women came together and said, well, let's think about our rights as well, sexual violence was not the first item on the agenda because it was considered divisive. But when women did start to talk about it within the movement, and partly led by women in the art world, it was explosive in terms of, how it was seen. And also, I think it was sort of stunning. Audiences of the early performances seemed to have been literally sort of shocked into silence. Nobody knew what to say.
And maybe staying on the same theme of sexual violence and harassment, it continues to be a problem of workplaces. And how do we change that? How do you see it in the restaurant world, Victoria? And I want to ask about Adrienne about the publishing world.
Yeah, I mean, for restaurants, it's continues to be an issue because, there's this phrase I'm sure everyone here has heard: the customer is always right. And it's just not true. The customer is often wrong, and that line becomes especially more thin or gray depending on how many glasses of wine or cocktails you've had, right? And so, it's a serious issue that is just starting now to be addressed. Sort of the Metoo movement happened in the wine and restaurant world about a year and a half ago, but there's still a lot that needs to be changed. There's a lot that's going to come out still, I believe. And particularly with the wine world as well, I think that people often assume with sommeliers, an acceptance of a glass of wine or drinking with someone, you're sort of entitled to do certain things, which is really not the case. And so this was also one of the reasons that I was inspired to start this nonprofit, Wine Empowered, which is a 501c3. And the great thing about Wine Empowered, it's myself and two other female sommeliers, and they're both Chinese as well. And they came from this background where they weren't welcome in this community, and they were often sexualized. We were all survivors of, harassment and rape within the industry. Unfortunately, it's incredibly common. And so we were like, well, how do we change this? How do we get women in positions of power? How do we get persons of color in positions of power to change the dichotomy and to make them comfortable so that if they speak up, they're not scared of losing their job? And so we realized that the biggest barrier was education. And so we provide tuition-free wine classes to women and persons of color in an aim to diversify these upper roles of leadership. And so the idea here is that there will be more women and those who are more sympathetic to these problems at the top, listening and believing women when these things happen with the customers, with colleagues, and hopefully it will no longer be socially acceptable to slap your waitress on the ass. That shouldn't be okay in 2020, but it still happens, unfortunately, all the time.
Adrienne, is it a similar world in the world of publishing?
It's it's funny. I mean, I'm just having a sort of nostalgic moment thinking about how great that was 3 years ago when Me Too was sort of getting up and running. I mean, wasn't that just so fun in October, November of 17? One man after another. We would just watch them go down one after another, and we don't miss them at all. All of these guys who seem so irreplaceable, gone, and never thought of again. But, you know, I mean, in terms of Me Too sort of changing the workplace, I don't think human behavior, certainly in the last 3 years, hasn't changed. Men aren't going to change. But what is different is that men are now afraid that they will be caught, that they'll get caught and get fired, right? I mean, so that's what we have. I mean, men are, you know, they actually know that they have something to lose now.
I think I'm going to stay with Adrienne, but I'm going to shift gears just a little bit from sexual harassment to another problem of the workplace. Adrienne, you have a great anecdote in the book. You describe a scene. I think you're with a colleague in a cab, and you see the paycheck. And I wanted to ask about the pay gap. Is this still a problem? And what do we do about the pay gap in very different industries?
So the anecdote you mentioned from the book is happened with my former colleague and still good friend, Dave Eggers, who started at Esquire at about the same time I did in the late 90s, 97, about the same age. Dave had a kind of an indistinct job. I had a very specific job. Dave's was kind of ephemeral, loosey-goosey. You know, Dave, was he an editor? Was he a writer? What was he? He came in at, you know, noon-ish, you know. You know, I mean, this was all before his memoir and McSweeney's. And Dave is great. And Dave also is very disorganized and has in his, and keeps a lot of like papers and random papers, slips of paper, receipts, whatever, like in his wallet. And we were in a taxi one night, and he paid, and a bunch of stuff fluttered down to the floor, including his pay stub. And I reached to the floor and picked it up, and I was astonished to see that his salary was exactly twice mine. And you know, it's funny. I mean, looking back on it, I mean, I didn't tell him that I saw it. I should have. Of course, I should have. I should have objected. You know, back at work. You know, when I saw this, but you know, I mean, the thing about salaries, though, I mean, it's such a taboo area, right? I mean, we don't talk about how much money we make. I mean, we don't know how much money anyone makes. Our spouses, really. I mean, that's about it. You know, but you know, everyone else is a mystery. You know, and in terms of what women can do for equal pay, I mean, of course, there are legal changes in this sort of post Me Too, the sort of renewed interest in ERA, but you know, but I think that probably the most effective response is probably something very simple, and that's just to talk about it, right? I mean, if we share our salaries, you know, and if we're not sort of twitchy and secretive and weird about it, you know, and I think that we sort of give voice to the problem, right, as we see it. And in that, you know, it would help a lot, I think, if we shared this information. Because information is power, as they say.
How about Victoria, Nancy? Do you have a similar experience with the pay gap in your industries?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, and I'm going to just confirm what Adrienne has said about how the remedy, and it's a really, you know, it's a tough pill to swallow, is honesty. I was thinking as Adrienne was talking about these conversations that we had, when I was, for several years, I was a member of the board of directors of the American branch of the International Association of Art Critics, which is, speaks for itself. And okay, so, art criticism isn't the quickest path to fortune or fame. But the idea was, how do we boost the salaries for our participants, and how do we make it more equitable, in terms of gender and race? And it begins with, so everybody, just say what you make, and we're mostly freelancers. So, it's very personal. You can't just talk about a paycheck. It's, what did you get for that assignment? And, what about the next one? And how did that work out? And, I think it's just the fear of exposing how little you're willing to work for, that holds people back. It's not, fear of losing the advantage you have. God knows, it's just not wanting to let on. So yes, shining a bright light is the best remedy, but it's
especially for freelancers. And going back to what Adrian was saying about the job descriptions, sometimes even in the same workplace, the job descriptions are not the same.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Victoria, I think you have a great moment in your book where a rude guest doesn't accept your expertise, even though you're an expert on this particular topic, and they send a wine back. How are women treated in positions of authority?
Yes, so this is the opening chapter of my book, and essentially, not to ruin it for anyone here, but essentially, very not nice guest returns a bottle of wine because he deems it corked. Even though, as a sommelier, it's your job. I know it's very hard. You have to taste every single bottle of wine you open. And so I had already tasted the wine, and it was beautiful. But he said that I had too much perfume in my nose as a young woman, and I had no idea what I was talking about. So I should return the bottle and bring him a fresh one. But this bottle of wine just happened to be quite costly, hundreds of dollars. And it's not so simple as just returning it. It was not my restaurant at the time. I was just a sommelier, and so as a result, there's certain ways in which your bosses can penalize you if you take back something that's actually correct. So I was very scared, and I didn't know what to do. But I did a sleight of hand. So I presented the unopened bottle, and I gave him actually the original bottle that he said was corked, and he said it was marvelous. It was amazing. And so it was kind of an example of what I had felt and continue to feel throughout my career, where women's opinions and their expertise is constantly questioned just because of the way they look. And I think it's changing now a bit. You're starting to see more women chefs and sommeliers, and yet still, we're often, again, belittled or sexualized or not taken seriously. And so I don't know what it's going to take for men to start respecting women. I think that's a bigger problem, but especially in the wine world, women have traditionally not been sommeliers, so it's an unusual thing for a lot of men to see, and it can be quite daunting for them, especially if they're on a big client dinner and they've just closed this deal and they're all growing out, they're being super macho, and then a young woman comes to the table and knows more about wine than any of them combined. It causes them to feel personally affronted. So I don't know what the solution is. I think in general, men just have to be more accepting and kind and understanding that women can know more about them in a certain subject and be open to that.
How do you feel about this? Especially, I was thinking about, Nancy, when you were talking about freelancing, where your knowledge and expertise is very important. What happens then? Are women's expertise, or is it taken seriously? And what can they do to be taken seriously?
I guess this goes to the question of editors that I've worked with and how they have supported or undermined me. And, I want to say that over the course of my career so far, I've felt more supported than otherwise. And I see there's a question in the chat column about having a mentor who helped you in your rise as a career.
Yeah, we'll get to that. I think at the very end.
Same answer. You know, I have felt supported by some, you know, a couple of pretty wonderful women, prominently Betsy Baker, who was editor-in-chief of Art in America for many, many years, and promoted the idea that journalism, you know, within the art world, journalism as a set of values, of criteria, is actually a pretty good model to follow. Even for those of us who call ourselves art critics or art writers, that's the more popular phrase now. But it has, you know, has my expertise ever been challenged? Yes, I've come up against some, you know, men who think they know better just because they're men. Sure, I think that happens to all of us. And it's, you know, it's angering, but, you know, helps to think of others who have been more understanding.
Adrienne, did you have a similar experience, especially in your line of work where expertise is you make decisions about books and value books? And what do you think?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I'm just trying to think. Yeah, I mean, of course, you know, older guys like, who are you? Where do you come from? Like, you don't have an MFA. Only somebody with an MFA should have this job. You know, nobody's going to take you seriously until you win a national magazine award for fiction. No. I mean, but there were lots of like wonderful. But I had lots of wonderfully supportive men. I mean, too, and you know, and women, and you know, so it was always a mixed bag. But you know, I mean, I think a lot of it did have to do with my sort of extreme youth too. You know, I was sort of 25, you know, and, you know, in editing and passing judgment on work by, you know, people who were essentially like my grandfather's age, you know. But I mean, also remember that I did have a certain amount of power through the job. So, you know, to my face, most people were pretty nice. I mean, because I could, you know, because I could be useful in helping them get published in the magazine. So.
I have one more question for you, but I'm just going to remind our audience to write their questions so that at the very end, we'll have time for their questions as well. I wanted to end on a positive note, and I wanted to go back to the Metoo movement that we mentioned. Just like Nancy was saying, the 70s were such an important moment. Do you see the Metoo movement as that? Did it change things? What did it do? And what did it not do? And is this our decisive moment? Where do you see things going? Nancy, do you want to start?
Sure. So the Me Too movement, yes, absolutely. I think made the downfall of the men who we've already mentioned possible, and it also gained traction from the success of making those downfalls resound with thundering sort of noise. Is it are there things that are still unsaid? Are there shortfalls? Sure. I think that, in the book, I say something sort of prickly about, the hashtag Me Too, and how it puts women in this sort of object position. It happened to me rather than I have, some control, agency with respect to violence or with respect to our lives in general. And, and also I think it welcomes this idea that it has happened to all of us, in some equalizing way that I think winds up meaning that women with a megaphone, women who are, privileged in a number of ways, including being young, get heard around issues that are not actually in a global way as important as, what is happening to women in, places where they're threatened just by being women, for instance, places around the world, people living in conflict zones. There's a lot that gets obscured in this sort of very generalizing language. And I think that's unfortunate, and that should be addressed. But hey, hooray for, all the strong women who have come forward and made these changes possible.
And the best thing about Me Too, one of the great things, men don't seem to like it too much. So we must be doing something right.
It's a bonus. Just a couple of minutes and a couple of questions from the audience. I think Cynthia's asking about mentors. Did any of you have any mentors to help you in your careers, male or female? And at the time, was a male mentor more valuable than a female mentor?
I would have loved to have had a female mentor, and I did. Well, and I did as a student. The most important people in the world to me were women. A literature professor and a women's studies professor, but and through this extraordinary woman at my college, I met the man who became my boss, David Granger. She was friendly with him. I was going to go to grad school, like everybody else in college. I wanted to write, and I didn't know how to do that. And going to grad school and getting an MFA seemed like a reasonable path. And she said to me, I'll never forget it, in the hallway, she had a difficult class and was having a moment, and she said, this was the end of my senior year, said, don't become an academic. It's a horror for women. And she said, I know a guy at a men's magazine, GQ. Why don't you talk to him? And it turns out his assistant had quit. And I was interviewed for the job after I graduated and was hired. And he was my boss at both magazines, GQ and Esquire. But it's a lot of sort of our sort of career trajectories, or mine certainly had a lot to do with luck too. I feel that my career was sort of at least probably 80% luck, and that lucky moment was for me meeting David Granger.
We have another question, and I think we'll be at the end of our time. What should we be teaching boys and girls about gender parity? And if you had any advice, what would you change in this issue for the next generation, especially in your different fields? So thinking about the world of restaurants or art or publishing.
I think for restaurants, I would just say give the wine list to both men and women.
It's always the men, right?
Yeah, it's a good suggestion.
In terms of publishing, I do believe that it's changing, and this is such a cause for optimism. I mean, I'm not there now, but I live on the Upper East Side, very close to the 92nd Street Y, and everything on, all of their signage is now sort of trapped in amber from sort of, February, March, April. And, and I think about this I've thought about this so many times when I'm walking by, because so many of the literary events from the spring the literary events that didn't happen were with women. The biggest event was to be Hilary Mantel, Elizabeth Gilbert. There's a sign, there's a poster for an Elizabeth Gilbert event that didn't happen. Isabel Allende, and then there's a much smaller poster for Richard Ford. 20 years ago, Richard Ford would have been the big draw. But so I just maybe I'm being naive, but publishing. It seems to me that the calculus has changed quite a bit. And that is cause for great optimism.
We'll end on a positive note. I just want to thank all of you for a wonderful afternoon of discussion on breaking boundaries. And I want to remind the audience that all these fabulous books are available. If you can see at the end, we have this link at Watching Booksellers. Katrina?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And I just want to add, I actually, on that last question that you had, I have this book, which actually by an Australian writer, and it's great. She's all about teaching, well, how boys will be boys and how to raise boys so that they aren't in that same type of boys will be boys future. So that's very interesting. I bought that from Watch on Booksellers as well, if anyone's interested. I want to thank you all for this discussion. Like I said, I have 2 girls, and I am going to be showing them the replay of this talk so that they can think about how their lives can be different in the future. Thanks to all of you for breaking boundaries. So thank you so much for being here and talking with us today. And thank you so much, Yasemin. Great questions. Thank you. And I'm just going to finish off just by telling everyone again to please buy the books from Watch on Booksellers. The button is below. And also that we have some more events coming up today. Our next event is American Poison with Eduardo Porter, which is all about how racism has destroyed American society. That's coming up next at 3 o'clock. So thank you very much. And if you'd like to view that, we can just have a look in the Crowdcast channel that we have here. And I'm going to also thank, I'll just get Matt, if you could just take them off screen and we'll share screen so I can thank the sponsors today who helped us to put on the festival. It's not quite the festival, as I said at the beginning, that we had planned, but we want to thank our sponsors, our festival partners, all of the volunteers who've helped us over the last year to put together the events today. And also, if you'd like to see the festival in the future and see all the programming that we're going to continue with Succeed Together, please consider donating, and we'll put the link in the chat. And thank you all, and we'll see you at some of the events later today, hopefully. Bye.